2 Timothy 2:15 in the King James Version says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Do modern versions pervert the Bible by changing study in that verse? For the last 8 months, I have had person after person bring up 2 Timothy 2:15 as an example of how modern English versions have corrupted and perverted the Bible, and how the King James Version is the only Bible that tells you to study the Bible. Here are clips from Mr. Congeniality himself, Dr. Peter Ruckman, and YouTube whiteboard artist Robert Breaker.
2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Now that is, if you have a King James Bible. If you don't have a King James Bible, 2 Timothy 2:15 is not in it. There's only one Bible that says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God," and that's the King James Bible. If you don't have a King James Bible, it doesn't say that. Don't even look for it. All these other new Bibles have erased the only commandment in the Bible to study from the Bible. Don't you find that significant? The one commandment of the Bible is study the Bible. Now, I know he said to search the Scriptures, but the only place where he said to study was 2 Timothy 2:15. So that word had been removed from all the versions. If you've got a King James, you've got the right verse. If you don't have a King James, you've got the wrong verse.
This is probably one of the most important verses in the entire Bible. And wouldn't you know it, new versions of the Bible attack this verse. It seems like all the important verses in the Bible on the deity of Christ and salvation and important things, new versions of the Bible say, you know what, we need to change that. I mean, that's too simple, that's too plain, that's too direct and to the point. I mean, wow, we better change that. Well, it's almost like new versions of the Bible are put out by the devil, not by God. Why would they attack something that's so doctrinal and so good? So let's look at this, and then I'll explain that a little more. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. The King James Bible says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." So the very first word given here is study. Study to show thyself approved unto God. Now, what do new versions of the Bible do? Every single new version of the Bible, there's over 200 Bible versions in the world today in English. And every single Bible besides the King James Bible takes out the word study. You can go through every one of the 200 plus Bible perversions, I call them, I don't call them Bible versions, and they all take out the word study.
Something these men said really got my attention. Ruckman specifically said that the King James Version is the only version that tells you to study the Bible. Is it the only English Bible to do so? Not even close. Why do older English versions use study and modern ones say something different? Because the meaning of words change over time as languages develop and as cultures change. The King James Version, the Geneva, Tyndale, Coverdale, and others, prior to the 1800s, used the word study. But the explanation is simple. The word study had a wider semantic domain, or it simply had more uses than it does today. And the use of the word study in that way that early translators used it is not the way that most people think of it when they hear the word study today. One of the obsolete meanings of the word meant to be diligent. When people read it today, they automatically infer that it means to devote time and attention to acquiring knowledge. But that is simply not the way that the King James Version or other translators use that word in 2 Timothy 2:15. Now, Dr. Mark Ward identifies the word study here as a false friend. It doesn't mean what most people think it means. Now, Brother Mark does a fantastic job of explaining that in his video on his channel, and I'll link to it in the description below. Tell him I sent you. In both of these clips, you heard these men speak of how the King James Version is perfect and untainted by corruptions and perversions such as modern English translations of 2 Timothy 2:15. How are modern versions perverting the Bible according to King James Version onlyists like Ruckman, Breaker, and the dozens who have messaged me telling me as much? Let me show you. But let me warn you, this is not for the faint-hearted, so brace yourself.
Do I detect a note of sarcasm?
Are you kidding me? This baby is off the charts.
If we look at a comparison of the King James versus several other modern versions, in 2 Timothy 2:15, we see this. The King James Version uses the word study. The LSB says to be diligent. The ESV says to do your best. The NASB, be diligent. And the New King James Version says be diligent. Now, I'll leave the philology of the English language to Dr. Ward because that's his area of expertise. And while I don't want to call myself an expert, I know enough about the biblical languages and textual criticism to know that this change is not the result of Westcott and Hort. It's not the result of the critical text or the Alexandrian line of transmission or anything of the sort. In fact, it has nothing to do with any difference between the critical text, Byzantine text, and the so-called Textus Receptus. Let me show you. Here's the modern critical text of the Nestle-Aland 28th edition for 2 Timothy 2:15 in the Greek. The Greek word that is translated be diligent or do your best is the Greek word spoudasin. Here's the same verse in Scrivener's TR, which is considered by many to be the perfect TR. As you can see, the same Greek word spoudasin is used in both the TR and the critical text. So since we cannot blame this on Westcott and Hort or Eberhard Nestle and Curtilon, then we must conclude that it is a matter of translating the Greek word spoudasin into English. Now, Greek verbs, like English, have conjugations. Conjugation is the process of changing the form of a verb to indicate things like person, number, aspect, tense, voice, and mood. The lemma or the base stem of spoudasin is spoudazo. In order to determine what this word means, we need to look it up in something called a lexicon. Now, a lexicon, in most basic terms, is a dictionary for a certain language like Greek, Hebrew, or Latin. There's a little more to them than that, but I'm trying to keep it simple. Two popular Greek lexicons are BDAG and Louonida. There are many others, and I have a growing collection of them in my library. Regarding spoudazo, BDAG says to be especially conscientious in discharging an obligation, be zealous, eager, take pains to make every effort, be conscientious. In Louonida, it says to be eager to do something with the implication of readiness to expend energy and effort, to be eager, eagerness, or devotion. A third work known as the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, or DBL for short, says, do one's best. That's where the ESV got theirs from. Make every effort. Now that we have defined that Greek word from a few Greek lexicons, let's measure that against how the King James Version translators translated the verb spoudazo. Here you can see commonality among the English words used for the Greek word spoudazo in the King James Version. Let's dig into some of these. In 2 Timothy 2:15, we see the word study used. In 2 Timothy 4:9 and 4:21, we see the phrase, do thy diligence. In Titus 3:12, we have it translated as diligent. When I shall send Artemas unto thee, or Tychicus, be diligent to come unto me to Nicopolis. In Hebrews 4:11, it's translated as labor. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest. In 2 Peter 1:10, we have give diligence. Wherefore, the rather, brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure. And then we see it's also translated as be diligent. 2 Peter 3:14 says, wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent, that you may be found of him in peace without spot and blemish. As you can see, in every place we have looked, the King James Version translators understood that word to pertain to some form of being diligent. And that includes their rendering of it as study in 2 Timothy 2:15. Therefore, modern versions are being consistent in the translation of the underlying verb, just as the King James translators were consistent in their translation. But since study does not carry the same obsolete definition it once did, that word has been rightly changed to be diligent or do your best. The King James Version translators were not wrong in their use of the word study, and modern translators going back to the Revised Version of 1885 were not wrong in their translation. It's a simple fact of language development over time. Arguing this difference in translations is making a mountain out of the ultimate molehill.